In the summer of 1991, a 16-year-old was sitting in a parked car on Southern Boulevard in the South Bronx when a van pulled up beside him and 3 men opened fire. He was hit 14 times. He climbed out through the back seat, crawled to a nearby bodega, and survived. Days later, with an IV still taped to his arm, he walked out of his apartment building wearing nothing but boxers and sandals and screamed into the street that if anyone wanted to finish the job, he was standing right there waiting. He was not bluffing for effect. He genuinely did not care whether he lived or died, only that no one would ever believe he was afraid. His name was John Mendez. The streets called him White Boy John. And 3 years after that shooting, he was dead at 19, guns down in a lobby a few blocks from where it all began, in a killing that has never been solved. This is the story of how a Cuban immigrant kid with a learning disability and an explosive temper became one of the most feared teenage hustlers in the history of the South Bronx during the exact years when the South Bronx was one of the most violent places in the entire country. It is a story that moves through homeless shelters, juvenile detention, a 14-bullet survival, and a string of unsolved killings, ending in a lobby on Southern Boulevard with a mystery that has never been solved. Joan Mendez Valentin was born on July 27, 1975 in Havana, Cuba, to Carlos Mendez and Marta Valentin. His father had already spent time incarcerated in Cuba before the family made the decision in 1979 to leave the island and resettle in the United States. They landed first in Miami, Florida, joining the wave of Cuban families fleeing economic hardship and political repression under Fidel Castro's government. Carlos Mendez initially found legitimate work at a Miami airport, but after suffering a workplace injury, he drifted toward the criminal economy that had taken root within Miami's Cuban exile community, eventually moving substantial quantities of cocaine. This was not an unusual trajectory for the era. Miami, in the early 1980s, was ground zero for the cocaine trade in the United States, and the tight-knit Cuban exile community, shaped by its own history of displacement and improvised survival networks, was deeply enmeshed in that economy at every level, from street dealing to wholesale trafficking. It was around this time that young Joan made a small but telling decision about his own identity. He noticed that his given name read as a woman's name to American eyes and ears, and he began calling himself John instead, the first of many identities he would construct for himself over a short and chaotic life. The family's next move took them to Union City, New Jersey, where John's grandmother lived. By the 1980s, Union City had developed such a dense concentration of Cuban immigrants that it earned the nickname Havana on the Hudson. Carlos continued building his criminal connections there, networking with associates tied to a much larger criminal organization run by a Cuban kingpin named Jose Miguel Battle that law enforcement would later refer to simply as the Corporation, an operation spanning gambling, extortion, and narcotics across Miami, Union City, and New York. The family's time in New Jersey was brief. They soon relocated to the South Bronx, settling into an apartment on Valentine Avenue. By 1983, John's younger brother Carlos was born, rounding out a household that on the surface looked like countless other immigrant families chasing stability in a new country. Underneath that surface, the instability that would define John's adolescence was already taking shape. From an early age, John exhibited behavioral problems serious enough that he was placed in a special education school where he was evaluated by mental health professionals for a range of emotional and psychiatric concerns. He was eventually diagnosed with ADHD and a learning disability, though people close to the family have suggested that other undiagnosed cognitive or psychiatric conditions likely went unrecognized given the limitations of care available to low-income immigrant families in that era. His emotional instability manifested in depressive episodes of volatile temper and impulsivity that would define virtually every major decision of his life going forward. School was a constant struggle. His learning disability made basic academic tasks difficult, and by 8th grade, he had dropped out entirely. He remained functionally illiterate for the rest of his life, able to produce only a barely legible scrawl when he needed to write anything at all. Because of the severity of his diagnosed conditions, he was placed on supplemental security income, receiving a small disability check from the government every month, a strange and quietly tragic detail given the enormous sums of money he would later move through the drug trade. In 1988, tragedy of a different sort struck the family. John's younger brother Carlos accidentally started a fire in the family's Valentine Avenue apartment, displacing the entire household. With nowhere else to go, the Mendez family ended up in a homeless shelter on Fox Street in the South Bronx, a neighborhood that by the late 1980s had become synonymous nationally with urban decay, arson, abandonment, and violence. The Mendez children remarkably adapted, making friends in the surrounding blocks and finding pockets of ordinary childhood even within genuinely difficult circumstances. It was during this period, surrounded primarily by black neighborhood kids, who mistook his fair, light-skinned Cuban features for those of a white kid, that John picked up the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life and beyond it, White Boy John. After roughly 2 years in the shelter system, the family received a Section 8 housing voucher and moved into an apartment at 1043 Avenue St. John, just a short distance away. It was here that John met a boy a year younger than him named Victor, who would become known on the street as Half Pint. The two became inseparable, and together they began moving deeper into the criminal undercurrent of their South Bronx neighborhood, a partnership that would define both of their lives for years to come. By his early teenage years, John had developed a habit of smoking wet, street slang for marijuana or tobacco cigarettes laced with PCP, commonly known as angel dust. The drug's effects, including disorientation and a kind of detached fearlessness, layered on to John's existing impulsivity in a combustible way. Acquaintances would later describe him as significantly more erratic while under its influence, and he and his crew would often purchase, or simply rob, bundles of the drug from a known supply spot near 161st Street and River Avenue, just blocks from Yankee Stadium. It was during this period that John fell under the informal mentorship of a local hustler in his 30s named Howie, a man notorious for ripping off his associates and customers alike, a habit that had earned him a long list of enemies and several survived shooting attempts on his own life. Howie recruited younger kids into his street operations, and John, along with Half Pint, became two of his most active recruits, robbing people on the subway and stealing cars, racking up a juvenile arrest record that grew quickly. That record eventually led John to Spofford Juvenile Correctional Facility in the Bronx, a detention center notorious enough to have housed figures who later became famous in entirely different ways, including boxer Mike Tyson and rapper Noriega. While inside, John was involved in multiple violent altercations, including one occasion where he slashed another inmate's face with a razor, inflicting a wound severe enough to require 150 stitches, what street slang at the time called a $150. Rather than rehabilitating him, his time at Spofford appeared to harden him considerably. Back on the streets, John resumed his criminal activity with renewed intensity, now robbing drug spots and their customers directly, and extending his reach to burglaries of stores and bodegas in Union City during visits to his grandmother. Meanwhile, his father Carlos remained entangled in the cocaine trade while also developing a serious dependency on crack cocaine himself. Carlos cycled in and out of jail before finally being convicted on a drug charge in 1990 and sentenced to several years in prison. With his father removed from daily life, John, despite being barely into his teens, effectively became the head of the household. He took on a paternal role toward his younger brother Carlos, attempting to keep him focused on schoolwork, even as John himself had long since abandoned any pretense of following rules. He was similarly protective of his older sister Olga, fiercely looking out for her welfare in a way that friends and family would later describe as one of the more genuinely admirable aspects of his otherwise chaotic personality. At 15, John began selling crack alongside a tight crew that included Half Pint, Guido, JJ, Alvin, Steve-O, and Bobcat. He also maintained a close relationship with an older neighborhood figure named Jilly, who would later go on to become the road manager for Big Pun, the legendary Bronx rapper. The crew set up shop on Southern Boulevard, carving out territory in the crack trade during a period when crack cocaine had become the dominant and most destructive drug epidemic the country had ever experienced. To understand the world John Mendez was operating in, it helps to understand the specific historical moment. The same year John began selling crack was 1990, the year New York City recorded 2,245 homicides, the highest annual total in the city's recorded history. The crack epidemic was at its absolute peak, and the South Bronx was one of the most concentrated drug markets in the entire country. John operated within the jurisdiction of the 41st Precinct, nicknamed Fort Apache by officers and residents alike, a reference to the besieged feeling of policing an area that frequently ranked among the 5 most violent precincts in the city year after year. A few blocks away on Union Avenue, a rival crew called Power Rules operated under the leadership of a feared 20-year-old named Miguel Guzman, known on the street as Meepo. Power Rules sold their own branded product, red top crack vials, and a heroin brand called Bad Boy, and extorted a street tax from smaller local operations. Meepo's reputation for violence was severe even by neighborhood standards, with widespread belief that he had personally murdered or ordered the murder of numerous people. Despite the age gap, Meepo's crew associated closely enough with John's younger group that locals began referring to John's crew as Junior Power Rules. Meepo had ambitions beyond his own crew, reportedly attempting to consolidate the area's smaller, fragmented drug operations into one unified organization under his control. Physically, John remained an unlikely figure to inspire fear. Standing only 5'6" and weighing barely 130 pounds, he did not look the part of a feared neighborhood enforcer. But appearances were deceiving. He was skilled with his fists and never hesitated to fight, and grown men twice his size reportedly gave him a wide berth. His temper was a hair trigger, his tolerance for perceived disrespect was effectively zero, and his frequent use of angel dust only sharpened those tendencies further. On the evening of October 4th, 1990, a defining tragedy struck John's crew. His close friend Alvin Rivera was sitting on a stoop at 575 Southern Boulevard alongside several other people, including a local hustler named George Chichi Garcia, who ran his own crack operation, assisted by his partner Pucho and his wife Melissa Polonio, a woman whose quiet demeanor masked a ruthlessness that, according to people in the neighborhood, made rivals fear her even more than they feared Chichi himself. A car pulled up. A man got out and opened fire, targeting Chichi specifically. The group on the stoop scattered for cover. Chichi sprinted into the building and slammed the door shut behind him, leaving Alvin, who had tried to follow him inside, exposed on the street. A stray bullet meant for Chichi struck 15-year-old Alvin Rivera instead, killing him at the scene. The neighborhood responded with the kind of communal grief that, however familiar it had become by this point, never lost its weight. Alvin's friends and family carried his casket through the streets, with John serving as one of the pallbearers. The killing drew coverage in the New York Times, a rare instance of South Bronx street violence reaching that level of citywide attention. A member of the rival Power Rules crew, who, in an odd coincidence, was also known by the nickname White Boy, was eventually arrested and charged in connection with Alvin's death. For John, the loss cut deep, and it planted a specific grievance that would shape much of his behavior over the following year. He held Chichi at least partially responsible, reasoning that Chichi's decision to slam the door and leave Alvin exposed had directly contributed to his friend's death. That resentment would simmer for months before exploding into open warfare between the two men. In the aftermath of Alvin's death, John's reputation and operational savvy continued to grow. His crew, now operating under an informal banner known as the St. John Boys, with Half Pint serving as his right-hand man, expanded its territory and earnings considerably. John's older sister's boyfriend, known as Grego, also joined the group around this time. The St. John Boys established their primary base of operations at a small park on Kelly Street, locally known as 52 Park. A Puerto Rican drug crew had previously controlled crack sales in that area, but John's crew forcibly ran them out and launched their own branded operation, selling crack in distinctive gold-top vials. By 1991, John, still only 16 years old, was generating significant profits. His explosive temperament, however, continued to create problems alongside the financial success. During this period, he stabbed another man in an altercation and was arrested and sent to Rikers Island. The case fell apart only because the victim ultimately refused to press charges, a pattern of near misses with serious consequences that would recur throughout his short life. By his mid-teens, John had developed a reputation not just for violence, but for an almost theatrical commitment to the flashiest version of street success available to him. On good days, his combined income from his various hustles could reach an extraordinary sum for a teenager in one of the poorest neighborhoods in the country. He spent it nearly as fast as he made it. He wore gold teeth and thick gold chains, including pendants depicting Lazarus, and owned multiple vehicles, including a Suzuki Sidekick, along with several Acuras and Hondas, despite never holding a driver's license, each one customized with sound systems loud enough to be heard from blocks away. He gambled heavily, frequently engaging in high-stakes dice games on Fox Street, and cultivated an image as a ladies' man. He maintained an arsenal of firearms and was rarely seen without at least one weapon, frequently carrying 2 TC-9 pistols simultaneously, and sometimes wearing a bulletproof vest as a precaution against being targeted himself. His personal tastes, somewhat incongruously given the violence that defined his daily life, skewed toward the ordinary pleasures of a typical American teenager. He loved riding dirt bikes and dancing, kept pit bulls, and was a devoted fan of Tupac Shakur in the film Scarface. Alizé was his drink of choice, and he had an enduring sweet tooth, regularly snacking on Kit Kats and Reese's and washing them down with Yoo-hoo, small, almost childlike details that serve as a reminder that he was, in the end, still a teenager. Despite his volatility, those who knew him well consistently described a more complicated, generous side to his personality. One frequently cited story involves a customer who tried to pay for a crack vial using loose change, irritating one of John's workers enough that the worker struck the customer. When John witnessed this, he intervened, making the worker pick up every coin before punishing him for his disrespect, reportedly saying he didn't care if a customer paid in pennies because no one knew what hardship that customer had endured to scrape that money together. Upon learning the customer was Cuban, like himself, John grew even more sympathetic and gave him a supply of product entirely for free. It was also during this period, through his mentor Howie, that John developed a genuine friendship with a young hustler and aspiring rapper named Joseph Carter Gaynor, who would go on to become famous as Fat Joe. Their friendship endured well beyond their shared days in the streets, and Fat Joe would later be among those who showed up at the hospital when John was shot, and among those who attended his funeral years later. John's lingering resentment toward Chi-Chi over Alvin's death had not faded. As John's standing in the neighborhood grew, he reportedly set his sights on removing Chi-Chi entirely and absorbing his territory. Chi-Chi, a seasoned veteran of the streets, was well aware of John's ambitions and watched the younger man carefully as tension between them continued to build. In the summer of 1991, that tension exploded into violence, aimed at John rather than the other way around. White boy John was sitting in a parked car on Southern Boulevard when a van carrying 3 men pulled up beside him and opened fire. He managed to scramble out through the backseat onto the street, badly wounded, and crawled to a nearby bodega seeking help. When the ambulance took too long, his friend Bobcat and several others loaded him up and drove him to the hospital themselves. Doctors found he had been struck by gunfire 14 separate times. While still recovering, John asked a friend to smuggle him some angel dust, which he smoked in the bathroom while his friend stood watch, a detail that captures both his addiction and his reckless disregard for his own state in the immediate aftermath of nearly dying. When he returned home, he discovered word had spread that he was dead. Rather than correcting the record, he told his family to stay quiet. Then, that same day, he walked out of his apartment building wearing only boxers and sandals, an IV line still taped to his arm, and screamed into the street that if anyone wanted to kill him, he was right there, standing in the open, completely exposed. Word on the street attributed the shooting to 3 men from the Dominican Republic associated with Prospect Avenue, allegedly acting on orders from Chi-Chi and Pucho. Whether or not that attribution was accurate, John believed it and began plotting retaliation before his wounds had even healed. Once he had sufficiently recovered, John set out to settle the score, reportedly carrying out retaliatory violence against 2 of the 3 men believed to have shot him. Around this same period, he caught an attempted murder charge, though it has never been definitively established whether it was connected to that retaliation or to some other incident entirely. His friends bailed him out using cash from his own stockpiled earnings. Despite his reputation for explosive violence, people close to him consistently emphasized a more loyal and generous side of his character. If he cared about someone, he was prepared to go to war on their behalf without hesitation, and he extended real generosity to friends and family, particularly during the holidays. When Fat Joe was shot on a separate occasion, John was reportedly the first person to arrive at the hospital to check on him. In October 1991, police searched John on a street corner and discovered an Uzi submachine gun. He was arrested and brought to the 41st Precinct. While in custody, John produced a hidden razor blade and slashed his own face open, creating a severe gash. He was rushed to Bellevue for treatment and a psychiatric evaluation, and his family arrived furious that he had been left unattended given his documented mental health history, with his mother threatening legal action. What looked on its surface like a psychiatric crisis turned out to be a calculated legal maneuver. John, fully aware of his documented history and his status as a minor, had deliberately self-inflicted the wound to manipulate the case against him, anticipating correctly that it would complicate things. The wound healed quickly given his young age, and the strategy worked. The attempted murder and weapons charges were dropped. Authorities, determined not to let him walk away entirely, secured a conviction against him on a separate drug charge, and he spent the remainder of 1992 on Rikers Island. Following his release, John resumed his operations without missing a beat, but by now police had developed a personal interest in catching him on anything they could. He became a frequent subject of street pursuits, sometimes fleeing on foot and famously eluding officers by sprinting across the rooftops of parked cars, other times escaping on his dirt bike. Given the increasing scrutiny, he grew more cautious about visibly carrying firearms, concealing weapons inside his vehicles instead. His volatility had not diminished. During one incident, after feeling disrespected in an argument with a friend, he shot the man in the buttocks, a wound serious but not life-threatening, a strange middle ground that characterized much of his violence during this period. His feud with Chi-Chi and Pucho remained unresolved, since both men proved difficult to locate, alternating between incarceration and extended stretches hiding out in the Dominican Republic. When Chi-Chi was eventually incarcerated in connection with the murder of a rival, his wife Melissa Polonio stepped into his role, running the operation. Melissa would go on to develop her own violent legend, later making headlines for fatally stabbing another woman at a gathering out of jealousy over her appearance. She fled to the Dominican Republic, was profiled on America's Most Wanted, and evaded capture for years before being apprehended in 1999 and sentenced to 20 years in prison. By 1994, at just 18, John had accumulated a depth of street experience remarkable for a criminal twice his age. His father, Carlos, had by this point returned from prison and folded himself back into his son's operation, an unusual reversal in which the father now worked under the structure his teenage son had built. John's personal life remained as chaotic as his street life. He was in a relationship with a woman he had gotten pregnant, marked by frequent conflict. During one heated argument, sparked by his anger over her speaking with a friend of his, she stabbed him with a knife and he drove himself to Lincoln Hospital for treatment. Around this time, Meepo reportedly approached John with a proposition: abandon crack and switch to selling heroin, with Meepo supplying the product for a cut of the profits. John declined, partly out of a widely held belief among dealers at the time that crack offenses were generally prosecuted at the state level, while heroin carried harsher federal penalties. Police continued their pursuit, but he remained undeterred, still recognizable from blocks away by his sound system. He had become a devoted fan of the notorious B.I.G., regularly playing Ready to Die, and in one ambiguous episode, drove up and opened fire directly in front of the 41st Precinct, an act some attributed to retaliation against the police and others to an unrelated target who happened to be nearby. As Southern Boulevard saw a growing Dominican population involved in the drug trade, John continued asserting territorial dominance, threatening a Dominican dealer selling green top vials on his turf with death if he didn't leave. In early December, a related dispute flared when Half Pint got into an altercation with a Dominican man over a customer. The two returned to confront him, Half Pint with a Mac 11 and John with an AR-15, firing at the man's feet as he fled. On the evening of December 4th, 1994, John went clubbing with two female friends. In the early morning hours, he drove them home before circling back to 571 Southern Boulevard. He parked in the middle of the street, left the doors unlocked, got out, and walked into the building. What happened next has never been fully established. Witnesses reported hearing John arguing with people inside. Shortly afterward, gunshots rang out. John was struck 3 times in the neck, chest, and side. 19-year-old John Mendez died on the spot. His family learned what happened through a phone call from someone on Southern Boulevard. By the time they arrived, the block was swarming with police, and inside the building, they found John's body on the lobby floor. Investigators recovered green top crack vials on his person, a detail that struck people as strange since John's own brand was gold top, raising questions about how they ended up in his possession. Detectives also noted clear evidence of a struggle before the shots were fired. John's funeral drew an enormous crowd. His casket was paraded through the streets, carried by his father and a group of pallbearers, mirroring the grief the neighborhood had shown years earlier for Alvin Rivera, except now it was for John himself. His father released doves during the ceremony. Fat Joe was among the mourners. People continued visiting his grave for years afterward, leaving Yoo-hoo bottles and Reese's on his tombstone. Who killed John Mendez and why has never been conclusively answered. The fact that he parked his car in the middle of the street and left it unlocked before walking inside strongly suggests he went to meet someone he knew rather than wandering into a random ambush. One theory holds that Meepo orchestrated the killing, reasoning that John, as his only serious rival, represented an ongoing threat. Another points to the Dominican dealer John had threatened weeks earlier. Still others believe it traces back to another Power Rules associate. What is generally agreed upon is that a significant number of people had real motive to want John gone, and that fear of retaliation likely kept most of them from acting on it until apparently someone finally did. John's mother asked the renowned graffiti collective Tats Crew to paint a memorial mural on a supermarket on Southern Boulevard depicting John with a gold chain and a TEC 9. The local community board objected, arguing the mural glorified gun violence, and Tats Crew eventually replaced it with a version that omitted the weapon. John's daughter was born a few months after his death. His family named her Alize after his favorite drink. The wider story did not end with John's death. In 1997, Miguel Meepo Guzman and 8 other members of Power Rules were charged in a sweeping 30-count federal indictment covering racketeering to murder. Meepo was ultimately convicted on numerous counts and received multiple life sentences. One of John's oldest friends, Bobcat, whose real name was Robert Williams, resurfaced decades later under troubling circumstances. In February 2020, Williams shot at 2 NYPD officers inside a police van, wounding one, then the following morning walked into the 41st Precinct itself and opened fire, striking a lieutenant. In August 2023, he pleaded guilty to 2 counts of attempted first-degree murder and was sentenced to 2 concurrent terms of 23 years to life, closing out one of the final threads connecting back to John's original crew nearly 3 decades after his death. Looking back, what stands out most about John Mendez's short life is how thoroughly he embodied contradiction. He was a small, delicate-looking teenager who, through fearlessness and an explosive temper, became someone fully grown men were genuinely cautious around. He was diagnosed with a learning disability and functionally illiterate, yet displayed a sophisticated grasp of how to build and defend a profitable criminal enterprise. He was capable of horrific violence, including self-mutilation deployed purely as legal strategy, yet was also remembered for genuine generosity and a fierce loyalty toward family. He died before he was legally old enough to drink the very alcohol he loved enough to have his daughter named after it. He survived 14 gunshot wounds through sheer luck and defiance, only to be killed 3 years later by 3 bullets in circumstances that remain unresolved to this day. To some who remember him, White Boy John was simply a reckless product of an environment that had failed him from the beginning. To others, he is remembered with genuine affection, as someone whose loyalty and generosity were just as real as the violence that ultimately consumed him. The honest answer sits somewhere between those 2 extremes. A kid shaped entirely by the brutal historical moment and neighborhood he was born into, who became exactly what that environment seemed almost designed to produce. His killer was never identified. His daughter grew up never knowing her father, carrying his memory only through the name he chose for her. And the South Bronx of the early 1990s, the most violent corner of the most violent year in New York City's recorded history, moved on without him, the way it had moved on without Alvin Rivera, and the way it would keep moving on through every name that followed. There's something particular about stories like John's that resist the neat moral packaging true crime content often reaches for. He was not a criminal mastermind building towards some grand calculated empire. He was a teenager diagnosed with real cognitive and psychiatric struggles that went largely unaddressed by the systems meant to help him, raised inside a household and a neighborhood that offered very few alternatives to the path he eventually took. None of that excuses the violence he inflicted on others, the lives he ended or helped end, or the fear he instilled in people simply trying to survive the same streets he was hustling on. But it does complicate the easy version of his story, the one where a kid simply chooses evil because he can. What remains in the end is a short, brutal, contradictory life that ran its entire course before its subject ever reached his 20th birthday. A kid who survived 14 bullets through sheer defiance, only to be taken down by 3 more a few years later in a building he apparently walked into willingly to meet someone he trusted enough not to fear. The South Bronx of that era produced thousands of stories like his, most of them never documented, never named, never remembered beyond the people who buried them. White Boy John's story survived because of how loudly he lived it. Whether that is his own kind of tragedy or his own kind of mercy is something the neighborhood that raised him has been left to decide for itself for 30 years and counting.